In this final chapter, I'm going to go over some of the more advanced features of Unreal, or some of the features that are very discipline specific, that have a lot more detail to them. Most of these could be an entire DVD unto themselves. But for now, I'll give you enough just so that you know where the interface is, so that if you want to dig in more on your own, you know where to get started. So first, let's look at scripting in Unreal. Now, Unreal has two types of scripting. One is called Unreal Script, and that's actual source code saved on disk. Uh, Typically, that controls more game-wide behavior. So weapon behavior or vehicles, stuff like that, is all controlled by Unreal Script. Uh, but what we're going to look at right now is the scripting that you can do inside of a level, and that's called Kismet. The icon to open up the Kismet editor is at the top of the window up here, this little green K icon. Now, the way scripting in Kismet works is first an event happens, like one of the teams scores a point, or the level loads up, or a player walks through this doorway. And then as a result of that event, certain actions happen, like a sound effect plays, or players are given a point, um, or a light turns on and off. So let's set up a really simple example, just so that you get a little exposure to the tools, and then I'll let you dig in on your own. So I'm going to move kind of fast here, so just follow along. First, what we'll do is we'll spawn a little explosion effect inside this room when somebody walks through the doorway. So first we need a way to detect when somebody walks through the doorway, and we can do that with a trigger. So I'm going to right click on the ground, add actor, and then one of the options that'll always be in the menu is add trigger. And if I visualize collision, either through the show flags or by hitting the hotkey C, I can see that this sort of pink cylinder is what's going to detect the player interaction. So I can make that a little bit bigger to fill up that doorway. All right, so now I also need to place a particle system that's going to get spawned. So I'm going to go to the content browser, filter by particle systems, and I know when we looked at earlier, jib explosion will look pretty good. So I'm going to place one of those in the level. Now what's going to happen, we're not triggering anything yet, but once I spawn in the level, that explosion will actually play once, but it goes by so fast you don't even see it. So let's open up Kismet and hook these things up together. First off, there are two kinds of events in Unreal. The first type of event is kind of a game-wide event. So as I was saying before, when one of the teams scores a point or when the level gets loaded, we've got a bunch of different types of events that can trigger then. So say when the level starts up, we want to play some fanfare sound effects and we want a bunch of fireworks to go off. But that'll only happen once when the level starts. Now the other type of event is based on an object in the world, and that's what we need here. We need this trigger object to throw off an event when somebody touches it. So right click, one of the options will be new event using trigger 2, which is what I have selected. And then I can choose, well, all kinds of different options, but touch is the one we want. And what's going to happen is whenever a player touches it, something's going to get kicked off out of this node here. So now we need to say what action we're going to do. And in the case of triggering an emitter, we need to toggle it. Essentially, we need to toggle it on. So I'm going to right click, choose new action. Oops. And then there's a toggle menu. And then the first option is just toggle. So we'll pick one of those. So I can connect now, touched to turn on, but we're not saying what we're toggling yet. This could be anything. This could be, well, right now it's just nothing because there's nothing plugged in. So I'm going to select the emitter, right click, and then new object var using emitter 3. Now, on my toggle node, I can click and drag from the target directly to that emitter object var. And now we've got something that's actually going to do something. When a player touches trigger 2, it's going to toggle its target, which is the emitter. So let's give that a try. I'm going to save the map. spawn in, and if I walk into the doorway, a small explosion goes off. Two more notes, and these will be kind of common themes as you build stuff in Kismet. This trigger node has a couple different properties. If I spawn in right now, I guess I should have shown that. If I walk through the doorway, the explosion only triggers once and then it's done with. It'll never play again. So if I go into Kismet and I select this trigger node, the properties are in the bottom left-hand corner here, and one of the options is max trigger count, and it's set to 1. Means it can only be triggered once and then it's all done. If I set that to 0, that's shorthand for infinite. It can be triggered as many times as it wants to. So now I can walk into the doorway and trigger the explosion again and again. Now the other thing I'd like to show you is on the emitter, I'll bring up the properties. We probably want to set it up so that it doesn't go off at the beginning of the level. It's such a short effect, probably nobody sees it, but that's a little bit of a frame rate hitch. And if you've got an audio effect or a longer explosion or something, you want to make sure that you got the default settings set properly. So I'm going to go to emitter, particle system component, and I'm going to turn off auto activate. So, like I said, that seems kind of special case, but you'll find that when you're working in Kismet, you have to do those two types of things pretty often. Even once you've got your triggers set up and your toggles and stuff, you usually have to look for little details like this, like the number of times it can trigger. And if you're working with an object in the world, you usually have to set some properties on it, like whether or not it should activate at the beginning of the level. But anyway, that's a quick overview of Kismet. I recommend poking around in some of the other levels that shipped with the UDK and see if you can dissect their Kismet, see if you can figure out how they work. One last little thing I'll leave you with. If you right-click, New Action, MISC, it's just barely on the screen, but one of the options is Log. And what that'll do, if you hook it up, anything you type in the obj comment here will show up on screen once it gets triggered. So type in kaboom, and as soon as I walk through the doorway, you can see in the bottom left corner of the screen it says kaboom. So that can be a handy little tool if you are digging into somebody else's Kismet code. Oh, and the shortcut for that is hold L and click for log. But that can be a really good way to figure out what Kismet is being kicked off at what point and how everything gets put together. Next, we're going to take a look at the Matinee tool, which is kind of the cinematic scripting tool in Unreal. Anytime you need to do something like create a scripted camera movement or play some gagged animations or move any objects in the world, like a door that opens and closes or a lift that moves, that's all stuff that you would do from inside of Matinee. So it's a pretty deep tool with a lot of features. So I'm just going to show you a really brief introduction, which I think a good test will be a door that opens and closes. So let's get the scene set up. I'm going to fly inside. We'll add it to this doorway here. I'm going to open the content browser, search for door, filter by static meshes, and then let's use this doorway here with kind of a V shape in it. And I'll place that in the doorway. And let's scale it up just so that it fills up the whole space. It doesn't need to look pretty for now. Now one thing I need to do before I can make this move is convert it into a mover. Kind of different from a static mesh. It's a little bit more expensive, takes a little bit different lighting. I won't get into that, but all you need to know, if you're going to control a mesh by Matinee, right-click on it, choose Convert, and then convert static mesh actor to mover. And there we go. Now we're ready to control it via Matinee. Now, Matinee is really closely tied to Kismet. You can think of it as an event. We'll set up a trigger so that when the player walks into the trigger, the door opens, and the door opening is the action, so event action, just like we did before. So we'll set up that trigger a little bit later. Let me just get straight into Matinee. I'm going to right-click somewhere in the blank space here and choose New Matinee. All right, you can see it's a Kismet block, kind of like what we've seen so far. Double-click on the Matinee block, and it opens the Matinee editor. I won't go into too much detail on the interface. I'll just show you what we need for now, which is this window here, the sort of second gray window, which is essentially all of our tracks. Everything that we're going to animate, we give it a track here, and then we can create keyframes for it. So I'm going to quick check in my viewport, make sure I've got that door selected, because some of this is automated if that's the case. So with the door selected, I'm going to right-click in the gray space over on the left-hand side here, and choose Add New Empty Group, and we'll call it Door Movement. Now I can right-click on that, and now we can tell it what kind of animation do we want to do. Lots of different options here, but right now we want to choose a new movement track. All right, and if you look back in Kismet, it automatically created an object node for our interpactor, the doorway. Oh, it's kind of two different terminologies. Interpactor and mover both mean the same thing, and you'll see both of them in Unreal. So don't worry about it, just know that they mean the same thing. All right, so a lot of the controls inside Matinee are similar to what you've seen before. Left-click drag moves the view. If you use the mouse wheel, you can zoom in and out. And you'll notice that there's these two little sort of salmon peachy colored triangles. That's the length of our animation. So starting at 0 seconds, ending at 5 seconds. This is a door that opens, so we probably wanted to go faster than that. So I'm going to grab this orange triangle on the right and bring it in to about half a second, something like that. Just click and drag on it. Now, you may also notice there's a little tiny red triangle up at the top here. If I click on that, that's keyframe 0 for this door. That's where its starting position is when the Matinee starts playing. So what we want to do is create a second keyframe at half a second, and then we can make the door move. So if you click and drag on the time slider, kind of where the time numbers are on the bottom, that's our current position in the animation. I'll drag it all the way to the right, and then click on this button in the top left-hand corner. If you mouse over, it says Add Key. All right, now with that selected, I can go back to my viewport and move the door up to where I want it when it's fully open. So something like that. And you'll notice there's sort of a dotted yellow line now. That's the path that the door is going to follow as it moves through time. So if I scrub the time slider, you'll see the door now moves open and closed. Simple as that. So close Matinee. Now all we need to do is hook it up so that when the player walks near it, it actually triggers the animation. Because right now it's just an action sitting there with nothing to trigger it. So let's create a new trigger in the scene like we did before. I'm going to right click on the ground, add actor, add trigger. I'm going to go into collision mode. I'm going to hit C, and let's scale it up. I went into non-uniform scale. So I'm going to scale it up so that it surrounds the whole doorway. All right, now go back into Kismet, right click, new event using trigger 0, and I'll choose touch. All right, and I'll drag a line between touched and play. So let's give that a try. Let's see what happens. Oops, I guess I spawned right inside the trigger. So there we go, it opened up. Real quick, there's an option called untouched, you might have noticed, which is essentially once the player walks out of the trigger. We can click and drag that to reverse, which means once the player walks out, the door animation will play backwards, which means the door will close. But to get that to work, I need to select the touch event. There's a property called max trigger count, which is currently 1, and which means it'll only play once. I need to set that to 0, which means it'll play infinite times. So now, if I spawn in the level, maybe a little bit farther away this time, and I walk near the doorway, the door will open for me. I walk away again, it closes. So, simple as that. Now, like I said, there's a whole lot more to the Matinee interface. Plenty more resources online on the UDN website if you want to look for more. It's a pretty cool and pretty powerful tool. So the next thing I'd like to show you is the skeletal mesh and animation editor. Now, a skeletal mesh can be anything in Unreal that has a rig essentially, or has some animations associated with it. So the obvious things would be a character or a vehicle or a weapon. But there'll occasionally be environment assets too, like a flag might have an animated ribbon coming off of it, that sort of thing. Um, so again, this is a much more detailed topic that I don't have time to cover fully, but I want to show you at least the basics of the interface. So let's click on skeletal meshes, and let's look at this one, Iron Guard Male, which is a pretty standard human character. You can zoom around in the viewport. The controls are pretty intuitive. So I guess the first thing to look at is how this is similar to a static mesh. So if you go in the bottom left-hand corner of the viewport, you'll see a tab labeled Mesh, and we've got some options for materials. If you scroll down, there's LOD settings, collision settings, stuff like that. Uh, so in a lot of ways, a skeletal mesh is the mesh component, but it also has a skeleton, and you can preview that using the icon in the top left corner of the window. So this skeleton was created in Max, I believe, but it's what drives the actual animation of the individual vertices. It's what connects the animation to the mesh. So that said, this editor is kind of both for that. It covers both skeletal meshes and it also covers the animation aspect of it. So if I go to the Anim tab up in the top left corner here, I can choose which anim set I want to preview. And you can see in the list here, I've got anim sets for all different asset types. Like this is a vehicle, and if I choose that anim set, I actually load up that vehicle. So let's go back to anim human base male, and that'll uh, give us this robot mesh, but that's okay. And essentially, what the anim set is a collection of animations that are related. And what this is all of the gameplay animations. So if the character can run or walk or fire a weapon, jump, fall, all these different sorts of behaviors, all these animations need to know how to blend into each other. So if we click through the list of animation sequences, we got some crouch animations here, death animations. There's a huge list, animations for riding on the hoverboard, and the character needs to know how to blend in between any of these. So if you've got an animation selected, you can click on the little play icon down at the bottom here, and it'll play that animation. But most of these are meant to be looping, so a lot of them are pretty short. Like this one, I think is only a second long, so there's not a lot to it. But that's just because this is the gameplay-driven animations. If you had a gag sequence where two characters talk to each other or something, that would be a different anim set that showed up in the list here, and you probably only have one or two animation sequences in it, and they would be much longer. So that said, there are a couple different ways a skeletal mesh can have its animation driven. Obviously, we just went over anim sets, um, but what that actually comes down to for one of these gameplay animations is it's driven by what's called an anim tree, which is how Unreal connects the code side of things to the animation side. So under object type, it's kind of a rare one, so it's not under favorites, so we're going to have to go to all types. And then I can choose animation trees, and there are only a couple. So let's open up the CH human one. And if I zoom out, this is effectively the tree that connects that particular set of animations to the gameplay. Definitely in super user technology here, so I'm not going to really go into much more detail than that. But there are two other ways an animation can get played. One, probably a little bit more familiar, is the Kismet editor. If you've got a skeletal mesh in the scene, you can play an animation on it either directly through Kismet or through Matinee. And the last way an animation can get played is through a physics asset, which the most common time you see that is when a player dies and they go into ragdoll and react directly to bullet hits and stuff like that. The character can actually react to physics properties. And you can create a physics asset for anything. You could make a filing cabinet that has drawers that move open and closed, or a hinged door that the top half hinges separately from the bottom. Any of that can be driven with a physics asset. So again, yet another interface that I don't have time to go into. But if you want to poke around on your own, be aware that it's there. So next, let's take a little bit closer look at Cascade, which is the particle system editor. I'm going to go back to favorites and filter by particle systems. And let's start by looking at an existing effect. Let's look again for Jib explosion. So obviously on the left-hand side here, we've got a preview. Um, Underneath that is a general properties editor for whatever you have selected. Uh, and in the top right corner of the viewport is what's really interesting. Each of these columns is a different emitter. So this particle system is actually made up of a couple different effects. And I can uncheck this little check mark here to temporarily disable those aspects. So right now I'm just looking at the sparks that fly out. Or I can turn off the sparks and the smoke and see just the fireball. Or I can look at just the smoke part of it. So you can see each of these emitters has a completely different set of settings and plays independently, but packaged together, they all make up the effect. So underneath each emitter, you'll see a whole bunch of different settings, and these are called modules. Each of these modules kind of has an effect on how the particular particle behaves, what kind of animation it plays, how it moves, that sort of thing. You can see the sparks have a little bit of acceleration, but the acceleration node doesn't exist on the smoke or the fire. Those pretty much stay put. But the fire, if you look at its preview icon, is sort of a 16 by 16 grid of little images. So that's actually a flipbook texture. So it's got its own sort of modules for figuring out how fast to play through that flipbook. So there's a lot more you can dig in with here. But one thing I'd like to show you is if you want to take this particle system or any other particle system and try to modify it on your own, you can pretty easily sort of duplicate this over, or you can take any single emitter and bring it into your own particle system. So what I'm going to do is go back to our custom asset package, and I'm going to right click and choose new particle system, make sure I have the right package filled in, and let's call this Spark Test. And we've got a blank particle system. So you could do a new emitter, but rather than building it from scratch, let's just borrow from the one that we were just looking at, use that as a starting point. So I'm going to re-search for Jib Explosion, open it up. Now the trick is I'm going to go select my emitter again. Oops. I got to clear the search field. So I'm going to select my Spark test. And now I can right click where it says Sparks, choose emitter, and then export emitter. And what that's going to do is it's going to take this and copy it into whatever I have selected. So now if I open up my Spark test, now I've got those sparks in there. And now, if you do that, you can really easily start messing with all of the settings, create new modules, change numbers, and you don't have to worry about accidentally clobbering an effect that already looks good. You can keep this as sort of a good starting point. And you can clone in emitters from different effects and piece them together and see what you can come up with. So there's a lot more to the interface, but if you're interested in, as always, just poke around a little bit more and see what you can figure out. So the next feature I'd like to show you is the sound cue editor. And that's essentially, if you import a wave file or something, it's what tells Unreal how that wave is supposed to behave in the world. So I'm going to filter by sound cues. Let's take a look at this first one here. I'll go right click, edit. Kind of a node graph similar to what we've seen before. Let's quickly walk through and see what's happening. Um, so all the way on the right-hand side, we've got two nodes, Fire, Impact, Explode 1 and 2, and they both get plugged into this random node. So essentially, every time this sound cue plays, it's randomly going to choose between one or the other of these two actual wave files. Then it gets plugged into this modulator. You can see it's got a pitch min and a pitch max, which means uh, sometimes it'll be a little bit higher pitch, sometimes it'll be a lower, uh, just sort of randomly within this range. And then likewise for the volume, just to help it break it up a little bit so it's not exactly the same effect every time. And then there's an attenuation node, which controls how quickly this falls off at a distance. And then that finally plugs into our little speaker icon, which represents what's going to be heard in the world. Really simple. There's a bunch of different types of nodes you can create to control how the wave files connect together. But it's a really powerful system that gives you a lot of control um, and lets you achieve lots of really cool acoustic effects. So lastly, I'd like to point you to the level manager. Now, there aren't any example maps with the UDK that use level streaming, but that's essentially what this is for. If you've got a single player level that you want to save some memory by streaming the different sections of the map independently, you can put them each in an individual new map file and then collect them all together into one master file called the persistent level. This is also really handy if you're working on a game team with multiple artists and designers. You can split up the map so that all of the Kismet is in one file, and all the geometry is in another file, and all the audio is in another file. And that way, uh, different people can work in the map all at the same time without stepping on each other's toes, at least not too much. Um, so, not too much to the interface. It's actually really easy to use. If you were streaming, you'd have a list of maps here. And then there are a bunch of options for visibility and which one is the current level that you're working in, stuff like that. Um, so if you need to use it, hopefully it'll be really obvious how that works. But for right now, just know that it's there, know that it's an option, and we'll leave it at that.